So let's finish up with the Inca. Now, this is a big task. Actually, we've had a few big tasks. Trying to describe some of these cultures in the short time that we have available is tough going. Trying to understand the intricacies of something like the Inca Empire, which had 12 million people in it and extended over 3,000 kilometers from Ecuador to Chile, and went all across the Andes mountains, is a tough thing to do. So what we're really trying to do here is just some broad outlines of what the state formation processes were like, and as I imply here, it was an empire. The Incan Empire was bringing together multiple cultures from multiple places over a vast area under one organization, one political, social, governmental, economic, and religious system. And in fact, the Incan name for their state, for their culture, was actually called Tawantinsuyu, which means the four parts together. So it actually is a their own name for themselves was an acknowledgement that they were different groups of people that had been brought together under a larger umbrella that we now call an empire. Cusco was its capital city, which is now located in modern Peru. We know, once again, like with the Aztecs, we know of the Inca through not only archaeological remains, but also from the reports of the colonial settlers, the colonists from Europe who eventually took over this area. And in 1533, a pretty dastardly set of circumstances took place where Pizarro, the conquistador Pizarro, kidnapped and murdered the Incan head of state Atahualpa. But it's important to realize that and we'll see this as we talk about the Inca here, the social system, the political system was already a little bit in a bit of disarray. Atahualpa was having a very long and hard-fought battle with his half-brother, and there was a war of succession going on at this moment in time. And Atahualpa actually saw this as an opportunity to partner with these newcomers, a small group of Spanish foreigners with some pretty heavy-duty weapons, and he thought maybe he could get the upper hand against his half-brother. But he was betrayed and as I said, kidnapped and eventually murdered. And this power play by Atahualpa backfired, and in fact, because the entire system was already in a little bit of a midst of turmoil at that moment in time, it gave an opening for the Spaniards to take over. Also, the infrastructure that they had created for their state served the Spaniards very well. So some of their accomplishments actually backfired on them at a moment in time when they were actually slightly weakened. Where do they come from? Well, we've looked at some of the cultures that already pre-existed in this area, and the Incan culture took over all of those areas that we've looked at already. And their own origin, however, kind of shrouds, their own mythology shrouds what we know of their actual origin, because there is probably little bits of truth hidden amongst mythological tales. Their origin myth recounts that Viracocha the god Viracocha, created the Incan ancestors and founded the capital city of Cusco itself. And then there were a succession of rulers that dominated over this culture and this entity, Incan empire, the eighth of which greatly expanded it, Viracocha Inca, the eighth emperor. Later rulers, however, had while it expanded and held together, and we're going to see how that took place in a moment here, but as time went on, they had harder and harder time keeping that uniform, cohesive group of the Incan Empire together, and there were a series of wars of conquest and succession between the rulers, ending, of course, with Atahualpa that we've talked about. But as rulers, as emperors died, they were still revered and considered powerful in the afterlife. And so once you die, that doesn't mean that's the end of your story. And in fact, this religious belief meant that we find a number of mummified remains that of deceased individuals that are given food offerings, and people would actually come back to these mummified remains, consulting them and trying to get their intercession and grant wishes and things. And this relationship with your ancestors was an extremely important one for the political organization. There were your kinship group was called the Panaca, and this is the collective descendants of an Incan emperor, and so that group is a kinship-based thing based on on your lineage. So you belong to a group because you are from the lineage of this particular emperor, and you receive property amassed by the emperor during their reign as the Inca. So not just items, but also things like fields and forests and mines become your property because of your inclusion in this Panaca. But once that deceased ruler dies, it does not hereditarily go to the next in some sort of family succession. The new rulers were part of another kinship group. And so there was struggle over once one ruler died, a new ruler came in from another group and they had to establish themselves. So that already has an inbuilt conflict in there. And they also were not inheriting any of the fortune that the previous emperor had obtained. That all went to his kinship group, their Panaca. And so they had a lot of property, a lot of wealth, but that didn't go to the new ruler. So the new ruler had to amass their own fortune, and that meant that every new ruler had to do something big to establish their authority and their ability to keep everybody together. So you had to do things, as we're going to see here in a moment, have feasts for people, treat people well, to keep things connected, to build big projects and things like Machu Picchu, for instance. The very famous site that we'll talk about in a moment was an outgrowth of this new ruler wanting to do something big that showed their importance. Not unlike what we've seen in Egypt as well. So Machu Picchu is one of these big ceremonial centers that was built by by Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui in about 1450 to 1470. It took some time to build. This is located in the Urubamba Valley, very high position. It's a high place. It's a walled compound, and there are multiple shrines built around the natural features of this very pointy mountain. And people went there for pilgrimages, it was a ceremonial center, but also, and from all over the Incan Empire. But also people came there for burials, to bury certain people from all across the Incan area. And some of those people, not everybody in the Incan society, but some people were selected at probably birth to have their heads bound, which would shape the development of their skulls. So it would be bound so tightly that the cranium would not develop the way a normal cranium would. It actually was directed in multiple different types. You can have elongated, the back of your head can become elongated. There's a couple of different types of cranial deformation that we find in burials at Machu Picchu. And these were probably specially selected individuals. We don't understand exactly why they were selected or what they were doing, but not everybody was selected for cranial deformation. Now, this is something we find in cultures across the world, but this seems to have been a typical practice here in the Incan Empire as well. I mentioned before that the new rulers had to establish themselves, and part of that was hosting people, hosting elite feasts for your subjects to show how beneficent you are. And these feasts took place in large halls with adjoining plazas, so you can have large gatherings of people. And we find this at the site of Machu Picchu to begin with, but also at Huanuco Pampa is another place where we found a feasting hall, or archaeologists have found a feasting hall with adjoining plazas. So this feasting was actually part of the political economy. If you wanted to keep the subjects over a very diverse and wide-ranging area, you needed to show them that you, as the ruler, were legitimate and you were beneficial to their lives. And how did you get all of this wealth? How did you amass wealth? Well, in addition to building ceremonial centers, building big, this sort of thing, we have the site of Sacsayhuaman, for instance. Also, such a huge area had to be held together through system of roads, or it was held together through a system of roads. There were constant military campaigns because not everyone believed that particular ruler who was trying to establish themselves was legitimate. Maybe I'm the ruler, I want to be in charge. And so you have constant military conflict within this large area of competing entities within the larger empire. And so these military campaigns maintained and expanded the empire, and had tens of thousands of troops. Of a standing army that had assaults on rebellious regions. And forts and garrisons were put up all over the place. Also a system of roads and bridges to mobilize people and goods, quantities of goods, people, military forces, and information, as we'll see here in a moment. For instance, you had to be able to communicate over long distances if you have this big connected empire. And we've found evidence for what's called a quipu system. And this was we'll show this in a moment, is a series of knotted cords with different colored strings that there's several theories. Your book talks about some of them, but it is certainly some form of communication. Perhaps just numbers, also perhaps more than numbers, maybe recorded verbal communications as well. And a relay system of runners bringing these communications across the empire on well-maintained roads was established. And so to build and to keep this empire together, the four parts, four major regions, these roads held it together. And there was in total 40,000 kilometers, which is about 25,000 miles of imperial roads that were maintained in the Incan Empire. The roads were made to sort of standard measurements, 1 to 4 meters wide, and they were lined with stone pavements. It rains a lot and it can wash these roads out, so they were maintained, but also they were paved with stone and had drains to wash the water away. There were bridges of various types, floating, suspension, and cable with baskets bridges. And then these relay messengers had stations. About 1,000 of these were distributed around the empire. They were called tampus, and they were administrative centers, they were storage facilities, and they were housing for the runners that were going between these relay messengers, bringing communications. They were stationed every 6 to 9 kilometers, and each relay messenger could cover about 240 kilometers a day. So this is a very sophisticated infrastructure that each new ruler had to maintain and control and fight off others that wanted to take control of that. And so I have a little bit of a, I'm not going to get too much into the quipu system, but it's, as I said, a system of knotted strings to record some kind of information. Could also be something more complex than just numbers, maybe communal memory. It may be individual communications that could only be understood to that to the people who knew. It could be administrative texts or histories. It could be accounts or economics. But in any case, the Incan Empire was a huge entity. It's really just summed up here, but it is that next stage beyond just a state. It was 4 states that were brought together, and ultimately it was fragile when the European colonists came, and it was at a weak moment when it was able to be taken over. Okay, that's it, and I'll catch you later.